That silence, that restraint, that refusal to complain or explain, I see now that it was not passive acceptance, it was active resistance. It was a way of refusing to give other people the satisfaction of knowing that the work was hard, that it was beneath her education or her capabilities, that it was something she would have chosen to avoid if she'd had other options. Instead, she made a choice to own the work, to do it excellently, to make it clear through her actions that she was not diminished by it. There is a particular kind of strength in that, a particular kind of pride. It is not the pride that comes from being recognized or praised. It is the pride that comes from inside, from knowing that you have maintained your standards and your integrity even when the world did not care. It is the pride of someone who knows that how you move through the world is a statement about who you are, and that statement is more important than anything external. I carry that with me now in ways that I did not fully understand for decades. When I do work that no one will notice, I think about grandmother's hands. When I am tempted to cut corners or to do something less well than it could be done, I remember the look on her face as she worked on that pale blue cashmere sweater, treating it with the same care regardless of whether anyone would ever know whether it was done well or poorly. When I face circumstances that are not ideal and feel the pull toward bitterness or anger, I remember that single word, no, and what it meant. The work of laundry is largely gone now from the lives of people like me. We have machines that we own and operate ourselves. We have lives that look, on the surface, very different from grandmother's life. But the lessons that were embedded in that work, in the movement of her hands and the rhythm of her days, those lessons remain. And I am grateful for them in a way that goes beyond words, in a way that is felt more than understood, the same way that grandmother herself expressed love and wisdom and care. Through her hands, through her work, through the quiet dignity of doing what was necessary. I remember one particular sweater. It was a pale blue cashmere, and it had come in stained with what looked like wine. Grandmother did not react to the stain as if it were a catastrophe. She simply treated it with the same care and attention that she gave to everything else. She soaked it carefully. She worked at the stain with her hands. She rinsed it with attention to temperature and gentleness. It took her much longer than it would have taken to treat a simpler garment, but she did not rush. And when it came out clean, it was as if the stain had never been there at all. I asked her once, watching her work on that sweater, whether she was ever angry at the people whose clothes she washed, whether she resented doing work that was so low-paying and so invisible. She didn't look up from what she was doing. She said, no. That was all. No elaboration, no explanation. Just that single word, delivered in a tone that suggested the question had been settled long before I thought to ask it. I think what she meant was something more complex than that single word suggested. I think she meant that anger would have been a luxury she could not afford. That resentment would have contaminated the work, and the work was more important than any feeling about the work. That maintaining her dignity and her standards required accepting what she could not change and controlling what she could, which was the quality of her labor and the manner in which she moved through the world. The hands that did this work were not smooth or delicate. They were strong and capable, marked by time and labor. The skin was darker than mine, lined with age and with the daily exposure to water and chemicals and heat. The nails were kept trim and clean, always, without exception, but they showed the effects of the work they did. There was a callus on one finger where she gripped the iron. There were small scars from minor burns that happened over decades of working with heat, but the hands were still beautiful in a way that was not about appearance, but about what they represented. They represented competence. They represented years of accumulated skill. They represented the ability to take something soiled and return it to a condition of respectability. Years later, after grandmother had passed and the work had become something that other people did or that did not happen at all, I found myself thinking about her hands constantly. I found myself thinking about the lessons embedded in those hands, the things she had tried to teach me through the act of doing work well. It took me a long time to understand that what she was really teaching me was not about laundry at all. It was about how to maintain yourself in circumstances that were not ideal. It was about how to do necessary work without allowing that work to define who you were. It was about dignity as something you created yourself, regardless of whether the world acknowledged it. I never became a laundress. That was not the path that was meant for me, and grandmother made that clear in her own way by insisting on school and homework and the possibility of a different kind of life. But I did inherit something from watching her work. I inherited an understanding that quality matters, that how you do things matters, that there is a kind of honor in doing necessary work well, regardless of what anyone else thinks about it, that maintaining your own standards is sometimes the only power you have. The baskets do not come through our kitchen anymore. The side door that faced the alley is no longer used for anything. The washer and dryer are different machines, owned by different people, if they exist at all in houses like the one where I live now. But I still smell starch sometimes, and it still brings me back to those Tuesday mornings. It brings me back to the sound of water running and the hiss of steam and the movement of hands that knew exactly what they were doing. It brings me back to the understanding, arrived at slowly over years, that I was being loved through that work, that the love was not expressed in words or demonstrations of affection, but in the commitment to doing something well, in the refusal to be diminished by circumstances, in the steady, quiet insistence on quality and dignity and standards that the world had decided were not important. That love, transmitted through hands and through daily labor, is maybe the most profound kind there is. I think about what grandmother did not say, because what she did not say was perhaps more important than anything she could have put into words. She did not say, "This is unfair, that I have to do this work." She did not say, "I resent the people whose clothes I wash." She did not say, "This is beneath me. This is not what I wanted for my life." She just did the work. She did it well. She maintained her dignity. She survived. I learned this without being taught it. I learned it by watching the way grandmother spoke to the people who answered the doors. I learned it by noticing that she never, ever complained about them, never made jokes at their expense, never treated their absent presence as something to be resented. She did the work, and she did it well. And that was the entire extent of the transaction. Everything else, her thoughts about them, her judgments about them, her feelings about them, was kept entirely private. What I did not understand until much later was that this kind of restraint, this kind of professional dignity in the face of work that was meant to be invisible, was itself a form of resistance. It was not dramatic resistance. It involved no raised voices or revolutionary speeches, but it was resistance nonetheless. It was a way of saying, through her hands and through her choices, that she was a person who made decisions and maintained standards and did things right, regardless of whether anyone paid attention. The house on laundry days had a particular geography. Baskets occupied certain spaces. The washer and dryer claimed their territory. The ironing board became the center of the house. But the rest of life continued around these things. School happened. Meals were cooked. Homework was done. Other people might have found this chaos frustrating, but grandmother seemed to move through it as if she had planned it all, as if the intrusion of other people's clothes into our space was a completely natural and manageable thing. Sometimes other neighborhood women would come by on Tuesday or Wednesday. They would come with gossip or questions or just the need for a moment of sitting down with someone their own age. They would sit in the kitchen or on the edge of the sofa in the living room while grandmother worked, and they would talk. But the conversations were different than they might have been at other times. There was a rhythm to them that followed the rhythm of the work. The talk would flow, and then there would be silence, while grandmother concentrated on a particularly difficult garment, and then it would start again. The presence of the work seemed to give the conversations a different quality, as if the work gave them permission to talk about certain things that might not have come up otherwise. I remember overhearing fragments of these conversations, talk about husbands who drank too much, talk about children who had moved far away, talk about money that never seemed to go far enough, Talk about younger women who did not seem to understand how much work it took to keep things together. These conversations happened in the background of ironing and laundry and the sound of water running, and I understood without being told that these were conversations that mattered, that they were important to the women who were having them, and that they were not meant to be repeated elsewhere. Grandmother never participated in the talk in the way the other women did. She listened, and she acknowledged what was being said, but she did not offer her own stories or complaints in return. She kept herself slightly separate, even in the midst of the conversation. I think now that she was protecting herself, or protecting something about herself. Perhaps she had learned that it was safer not to fully confide in people, not to make yourself vulnerable to judgment or gossip. Perhaps she had learned that maintaining a certain distance made it possible to be treated with respect, or perhaps she simply preferred it that way, preferred to remain somewhat unknowable. The work of laundry was never presented to me as something I should aspire to do, but it was also never presented as something shameful or beneath notice. It was simply what grandmother did, the same way other grandmothers might have done other things. It was work, and work was something to be respected, and that was the end of it. There was no drama about it, no explanation, no justification, just the reality of it, day after day, year after year. What I understand now is that I was being taught a lesson about what dignity means when you are a person whose labor is invisible to the world. Grandmother was not bitter about this. She was not angry, but she was also not resigned. She maintained her own standards of quality and professionalism. She kept her own counsel. She did not allow other people to define what her work was worth, even if the monetary compensation was never going to reflect the skill and care that it required. The clothes came and the clothes went. The seasons changed, and the weight of the fabrics changed with them. Summer meant lighter materials, more frequent washings, more frequent deliveries. Winter meant heavier coats and sweaters that required more delicate handling. But the rhythm remained the same. The work continued. The hands kept moving. The pride in doing the work well remained constant. I would sit on the floor nearby, supposedly doing homework or reading, but really watching the way her hands worked. There was a kind of rhythm to it that seemed almost meditative. Press, fold, move to the next item. Press, fold, move. The repetition would have been mind-numbing for most people, but she seemed to find something in it, seemed to settle into it the way other people settled into music or prayer. Sometimes she would hum, barely audible, almost to herself. Sometimes she would ask me to bring her something. A spray bottle of water, a hanger, a piece of paper to write a name on for one of the garments. The names were important. She kept a careful list, always written in her precise handwriting of which clothes belonged to which person. There was Mrs. Patterson's work uniforms, carefully starched and pressed so they would hold their shape through a whole week of work. There was Miss Eleanor's blouses, delicate things that required particular handling. There was the judge's shirts, and I was never told his actual name, only called him the judge, which gave the whole arrangement a kind of formality, which had to be ironed in a very specific way, with particular attention to the collars. These people, whose lives were contained in the clothes grandmother pressed, seemed to exist in a realm parallel to ours. They lived in different houses, wore different clothes, and moved through the world in ways that were entirely foreign to the life I knew. But their clothes came into our house, and for a few hours they occupied the most intimate of spaces, passing through grandmother's hands in a state of undress that would have been shocking if anyone had been there to witness it. She washed their undergarments. She handled their soiled things. She restored them to a condition that was suitable for their owners to be seen in public. What I think now, what I could not possibly have understood then, is that grandmother knew something about those people that they did not know about themselves. She knew what they sweated through, what they stained, what they wore that they thought no one would ever see. She knew the texture of their lives in a way that was more intimate than they would have allowed if they had stopped to think about it. But she would never have acknowledged this knowledge, never have used it, never have done anything but her work with complete professionalism and propriety. The money for this work was not discussed in my presence. I do not remember being told how much grandmother charged, or how often the bills were paid, or whether the people she worked for paid promptly or made her wait. What I knew was that this work provided something essential to the household, and that grandmother considered it to be important and necessary, even if the world considered it to be beneath notice. The clothes were delivered back to their owners on Thursday afternoons. I sometimes went with grandmother to help carry the bags and boxes. We would ring doorbells and wait. Sometimes the people answered the door themselves. Sometimes they sent someone else, a husband or a child or a maid. Grandmother would hand over the neatly folded and wrapped packages without fussiness, accepting payment without counting it in front of people, making small talk about the weather, or asking about children or new jobs. She was unfailingly polite, but there was also something that I can only describe as a kind of reserve, a line that she did not cross, a professional distance that was maintained without rudeness. One time I remember a woman named Mrs. Porter asked grandmother if she could stay for coffee. Grandmother declined politely, saying she had other deliveries to make, but later, when we were walking home, grandmother's face was different. There was something in it that I had never seen before, and it took me years to recognize it as the memory of a kindness that could not quite be accepted, because to accept it would have required crossing that line that had to be maintained in order for the work to continue. The line was invisible, but it was absolute. It was the line between service and friendship, between work and intimacy, between the person whose hands did the labor and the person whose clothes were being cared for. That line existed not because grandmother was unfriendly or because the people she worked for were cruel, but because both sides understood that for the arrangement to work, for it to be sustainable and professional and respectable, the line had to exist. If the line were crossed, the whole thing would become something else, something that neither side could afford. There was a particular smell that belonged to Tuesday mornings. It was not unpleasant. Nothing about grandmother's work produced anything truly unpleasant, but it was distinctive enough that a child learned to recognize it as the signal that the week had shifted into its working rhythm. The smell was starch and heat and something else that had no name but meant transformation was happening. Baskets of other people's clothes arrived in our kitchen through a side door that faced the alley, and for 2 days those clothes occupied the entire landscape of the house, turning bedrooms and the living room into a kind of laundry kingdom where normal life had to move around the work rather than the work fitting into the spaces of normal life. Grandmother was a laundress, not the kind of woman who took in occasional washing when money was tight, though she did that too, but someone for whom laundry was the architecture of her life, the thing that organized time and space and purpose. She had been doing this work for longer than I had been alive, and it was understood without needing to be stated that this was how the house would continue to exist, how bills would be paid in their small way, how there would be money for school clothes even if those clothes came from the clearance rack at the discount store. The work began very early on Tuesday mornings before the sun was fully up. Grandmother was already in the kitchen when I came down for breakfast, and the first baskets had already been sorted, the clothes divided into categories that existed only in her mind, but followed a logic as precise as mathematics. Whites went one direction, colors another. Delicates were placed with extreme care, as if they were precious things rather than the everyday undergarments and slips and stockings of women I would never meet. She sorted in silence, her hands moving with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing something thousands and thousands of times. The kitchen table disappeared under piles of clothing. The sofa in the living room became another sorting station. The washer and dryer in the small room off the kitchen ran in a steady rhythm that became the heartbeat of the house for those 2 days. The sound of water running, the mechanical whine of the washer, the tumble and spin, the heat of the dryer, these sounds formed a constant accompaniment to everything else that happened. Meals were cooked around it. Homework was done to the soundtrack of it. Conversations happened, but quietly, because the machinery had a claim on attention that nothing else could quite match. What I did not understand then, what took decades to understand, was that grandmother was teaching me something through this work without ever saying the words out loud, She was teaching me about labor that would never be acknowledged, about skill that would never be listed on anyone's resume, about the kind of pride that exists in doing something well when the world has decided that thing does not matter. She was teaching me that dignity was something you maintained, something you actively preserved, not something that was given to you by external circumstances or other people's opinions. The ironing happened on Wednesday. The clothes, dried and folded in a particular way, came out of storage and were returned to their ironed state, which was somehow more elegant than their original form had been. This was the work that required the most attention. The ironing board was set up in the living room in front of the window where the light was best, and grandmother worked there for hours. Her hands moved with a kind of authority that made the iron seem like an extension of her own will. Every seam was pressed, every collar was shaped, every pleat was restored to its intended geometry. The smell of starch grew stronger as the day progressed. Hot cotton, the slight hiss of steam, the particular tang of the starch spray that she kept in a bottle and used with precision. She would have a radio on low, tuned to a station that played soft music between news updates and advertisements. The iron itself was old but immaculate. It had weight to it, actual substance, not like the lightweight things that exist now. The cord was wrapped carefully. The sole plate was kept clean. Every inch of it showed the care of someone who respected her tools because her tools were what allowed her to do her work.